How's it going, everyone? It's Blake here from ChessPathways.com, and in today's openings video, we're going to be taking a look at the Tarrasch Defense. The Tarrasch Defense is a response to the Queen's Gambit, so the game begins with d4, d5, c4. Here, black plays e6, so it looks like we're going to get a Queen's Gambit declined, but now after white plays knight to c3, their most popular move, black's going to lash out at the center right away, and try to neutralize white's space advantage by playing pawn to c5. This is the starting position of the Tarrasch Defense, and it's easy to see why this appeals to a lot of players here with black. Compared to one of the main moves here of the Queen's Gambit declines, knight to f6, black might be wondering, why should I allow white to have this space advantage with two pawns against one here in the center? I can play this move c5 myself, and it's completely safe. It's defended by the bishop, my d-pawn's defended here, so why not go for this? So let's take a look at how the game can go. The main downside of the Tarrasch Defense is that black can get saddled with an isolated d-pawn. So let's see how white can achieve this. White's most popular move is to respond with c takes d5. Black should respond with e takes d5. We'll come back and discuss some early alternatives later, but in this position, we see that after this d-pawn gets exchanged for black's c-pawn later on, black's going to be left with an isolated pawn here on d5. Now this could be a strength for black. Black does have a space advantage, black has open lines for the pieces, and black usually does not succeed in getting a space advantage this early in the Queen's Gambit, so that's definitely a plus for black. But this isolated d-pawn could also be a liability if white piles up on it, and that's what white is going to try to do. In this position, white usually plays knight f3 to develop a piece. Black can respond with the very logical knight c6, and now white simply plays g3, trying to put this bishop on the g2 square, where it can start eyeing this vulnerable d5 pawn. So I'll show one of the main lines from here, and then like I said, we can come back and discuss both sides' alternatives. Black usually continues developing here with knight to f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, castle, castle. Both sides just wanted to get castled before that center opens up, always a good idea. And now white plays bishop g5. And this is a very logical move if we think about white's plan to put pressure on this black center. White is threatening to take here on f6, which actually serves two purposes. We know this knight is one of the key defenders of this d-pawn, so white would be eliminating it. And also, if black played some nothing move here and white took on f6, what does black do? If black takes with the g-pawn, they've wrecked the shelter there for their king. And if they take with the bishop, now this c5 pawn is undefended. So that would not be so great for black. And that's why after bishop g5, white usually succeeds in provoking black into playing c takes d4 to clarify that pawn tension. Now after knight takes d4, white has great control of this outpost. We always know that when there's an isolated pawn, the square in front of it is going to be an outpost because no enemy pawns can kick this piece away. And of course this bishop now is open to attack this d5 pawn. Here black often plays h6 to kick this bishop away from this annoying g5 square while black still can. It would actually be too early here for white to go for this plan of removing the defender, because if white took on f6 here, now it looks like the d5 pawn is hanging, white has two attackers on it and black only has one defender, but the problem is the d4 knight is hanging too. And now black has the pair of bishops as well, so white usually will not go for this. After h6, white can simply retreat to e3 with that bishop. You usually don't want to block in your central pawns like this, but here it's perfectly fine. There's no reason this e-pawn has to move. This bishop has already found a nice home here on g2, and this bishop adds control to this d4 outpost. So now rook e8, putting that rook on an open file. White does the same with rook c1, bishop f8, getting that bishop out of the way. And now that white's fully developed, white often decides that right now is the best time to change the pawn structure. White's probably not going to succeed in winning this pawn outright, but white can play here knight takes c6, b takes c6, knight a4, and now instead of an isolated pawn, we have what are called hanging pawns, or the isolated couple, where we have these two pawns that are together, but there's no pawns adjacent to them. And these pawns can still be weaknesses. White has really good control of the c5 and d4 squares. It's going to be really hard for these pawns to advance. This c6 pawn is backwards and under attack, and after bishop d7, bishop c5, white tries to exchange off that somewhat awkward bishop here on e3, and if black were to exchange here, white would have a nice outpost on c5 for the knight. So that was one of the main lines of the Tarrasch Defense. Coming back here to move 6, after white plays g3, we only looked at knight f6 before. Let's consider black's major alternative here, which is to play pawn to c4. You may have been wondering why black can't play this move to avoid the isolated pawn situation, and black certainly can, and this pawn structure is known from the Panov variation of the Caro-Kann. This is called the advanced Panov structure, and black has a very strong 3-on-2 pawn majority here on the queen side. That could be very strong in an endgame, but in the meantime, white has a lot of plans here. White could try to pressure this d5 pawn with moves like bishop g2, white could try to break with b3, white could try to break with e4, and another downside of this c4 move is it takes all the pressure off the white center. So I'll show a sample line from here. White most often plays bishop g2, they were kind of committed to this move when they played g3, and now black's idea is often to play bishop b4 here and try to remove a key attacker here of this d5 pawn. Castles, knight g to e7, this knight could come to f6, but then bishop g5 is kind of annoying. Since black doesn't have the bishop on e7, there's no real good way to deal with this. White's threatening to just take this knight, and if black takes with the g-pawn, they have doubled pawns. If they take with the queen, then d5 is hanging, and black would kind of be forced to give up the bishop pair here with taking on c3, or retreating to e7, which is kind of inconsistent. So that's why on this line, the knight will usually come to e7, so that bishop g5 is not a problem. You can always kick it away with f6. So instead, white often plays e4, that pawn break we talked about, striking at the black center. Now at first this move doesn't look safe. It looks like black can remove the defender here with bishop takes c3, but this is nothing really for white to fear. After white recaptures that bishop and black wins the e4 pawn, this pawn's very vulnerable and white's probably going to win it right back. White can play knight to d2, and there's no way for black to defend both of their weak pawns. This c4 pawn became very weak after white got that pawn break in. Plus, white now has the bishop pair, so black's probably not going to go for this. Instead, after e4, black can just take there on e4 right away, knight takes e4, castle, a3, kicking this bishop away and forcing it to find another square, and after bishop a5, really its only square to go to, now queen a4 can be played, targeting this weak c4 pawn. Ironically, in this line, it's white who ends up with an isolated d-pawn, and black certainly has good pressure there with the knight and queen against that pawn, but black can't take it right away because this bishop is loose, and this c4 pawn, white could argue, is just as weak or even weaker than white's d4 pawn. Alright, we've looked at a lot of the key themes that can happen in the main line after c takes d5 and the early g3 after knight f3. Let's take a look at some alternatives. One alternative white has is to take on d5 and then immediately take on c5, putting this d5 pawn under attack immediately. So if this bishop recaptured the pawn, white would win a pawn right away with queen takes d5. That's the idea. So instead, when white takes on c5, black needs to play this in-between move d4 before they can recapture their pawn. Now white has a couple choices. Knight e4 looks very logical. White simply defends the c5 pawn and centralizes that knight. And now it's black who has a couple options. Black could win the pawn back right away with a tactic. Black can play bishop takes c5, winning their pawn back, and if white takes that piece, black's going to get the piece back with queen a5 check. And now after, for example, bishop d2 and queen takes c5, material is equal, but white has the bishop pair and they're going to get a lead in development after rook c1. Black would have to play queen f5 to defend the bishop, so black usually will not go for this. White is doing quite well here. So instead, after knight e4, black doesn't need to play bishop takes c5 to use that tactic to get the pawn back. Black can just play bishop f5, develop a piece, and attack this knight. White could play here knight d6 check, forcing black to give away the bishop pair here, but black simply regains the pawn, and this d4 pawn might be a thorn in white's side if white's not able to win that pawn. So instead, after bishop f5, white could just play knight g3, kind of like in the Caro-Kann, just counterattacking that bishop, but the bishop can just drop back to e6 in this case, and now finally it's very hard for white to defend this c5 pawn. The bishop's probably going to take it next turn. White's alternative is after d takes c5, d4, white could play knight a4 to defend this pawn. This is the more popular option for white because it's much harder to harass this knight on a4, and black's probably going to have to rely on that queen a5 check tactic to get the pawn back, but first they can play knight c6 just so there's no battery here on the c file like we saw against that queen and bishop. For example, after knight to f3, bishop takes c5, a temporary piece sacrifice, knight takes c5, queen a5 check, bishop d2, queen takes c5, and material is equal. So that was after c takes d5 and then d takes c5 immediately. A slightly different version of this for white is to play d takes c5 first, and once again, the bishop can't really capture here right away because now this d5 pawn is hanging. White has 3 attackers on it. So instead, black still has to play the in-between move d4. And this looks very similar to the previous line, and you could argue it's kind of a worse version for white, because now white's extra pawn is a doubled pawn. After, for example, knight e4, black could just play knight f6, trying to exchange this knight off, so it doesn't defend the c5 pawn, and black is going to be doing fine. Coming back here to the starting position, after c takes d5, we've only been looking at e takes d5. Black could also play c takes d4, and this can be a little bit tricky for white to handle if they haven't seen it before. For example, queen takes d4 looks very good for white at first glance. White simply recaptures the pawn, and now black can't get their pawn back here on d5, because now the queen adds some support there. But black would now have knight c6. And I just pulled one sample line here to show how black can get compensation. This queen has to retreat. And now white still does succeed in staying a pawn ahead after e takes d5, queen takes d5. But black's just going to try to keep pieces on the board, play bishop d7, and try to harass this queen next turn with knight f6, and after, for example, knight f3, knight f6, queen d1, bishop c5, black could claim to have some compensation for a pawn here with their lead in development, although I would still prefer to be white with the extra pawn here. But I think white even has a more promising move here, going back to move 5, after c takes d4, white can actually, instead of taking this pawn back, white can play queen a4 check. And here it's much harder for white to find a good move. After, for example, bishop d7, now white can take the pawn back on d4 and there's no more knight c6. And after queen d7, then knight b5 is very strong. White's threatening knight c7 check with a fork, and this queen would not be able to take that knight because it would be pinned to the king. So after c takes d5, throwing in c takes d4 is not a very reputable sideline. Black is better suited sticking to the main lines with e takes d5. Coming back here to the starting position, white has an alternative here. They don't have to take on d5 or c5. White could play something like e3, simply now defending the c4 pawn, and we're going to get a very symmetrical position after something like knight f6, knight f3, knight c6. Both sides can delay a little bit here from taking on d5 or c5 after, for example, a3 or a6, just kind of useful moves preventing bishop b4 and bishop b5. But eventually someone's going to have to release the pawn tension. One sample line continues d takes c5, bishop takes c5, b4, and white's trying to expand here on the queen side. Bishop a7, bishop b2. No one ends up with any isolated pawns, and we're left to play a middle game from here. Finally, there's one more point to discuss. Let's say black wants to play the Tarrasch defense against the queen's gambit, and we saw how after knight c3 they can play c5. What if white does not play knight c3 here? White certainly has other moves they can play. If white plays knight to f3, for example, can black still play the Tarrasch defense? Yes, they can. They can simply play c5. And I guess white has some sidelines here that are specific to this variation. For example, they could play c takes d5, e takes d5, and immediately bishop g5. I guess trying to save a tempo from not playing knight c3. But this is not very scary for black. Simply bishop e7, and black is fine. More often, after a c5 here, white's going to transpose back to a mainline Tarrasch defense with c takes d5 and knight c3. The story's pretty similar after g3, another popular move for white. Black can definitely play c5 and go back into a Tarrasch defense. Another option for white is to play the exchange variation of the queen's gambit declined. But even here, black can still reach a Tarrasch defense. After, for example, knight c3, c5, we reach the exact same position that we reached in the main line after c takes d5, e takes d5 in the Tarrasch defense. So even though the Tarrasch defense is most often associated with this position right here, after 3 knight c3 and c5, you should be able to reach it after pretty much any variation of the queen's gambit declined. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please make sure you visit chesspathways.com. I'll put a link down in the description and get signed up there. It's totally free, only takes 5 seconds. And I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you join. So please let me help you become the best chess player you can be and get signed up. Thanks, and I'll see you there.